A lot has been said over the last 4 years about Into the Radius since its Steam debut in 2020. The developers call it a survival shooter, Wes calls it a single-player extraction shooter, reviewers praise it for its weapon variety and realism, and gamers are just thrilled that it's a high-quality, full-length VR game. And now that it's here on PlayStation VR2, and I've played it for myself, I have to say that I agree with everything that's been said, but I'm going to add 2 things to that list. 1, it's addictive as f***, and 2, thankfully, really fun, or I never would have survived the absolutely brutal difficulty curve. Into the Radius drops us into the aftermath of the Petchorsk event, vaguely described as an earthquake that changed the landscape of a small Soviet mining town, resulting in a desolate, dangerous wasteland. As a UNPSC specialist, you're tasked with venturing deeper and deeper into the zone, clearing out enemies and retrieving valuable items and documents. And basically, just trying to survive. The missions have just enough variety in them to keep things interesting, so while you're always defending yourself, it's not all about combat. Sometimes you're on weird scavenger hunts for invisible items, and sometimes you'll be photographing specific enemies for documentation, and it's all significantly scarier than you'd expect. A lot of that comes from the dystopian setting. The zone has been abandoned, but there are still dangers everywhere. The first enemies you encounter are straight out of It Follows. They walk slowly towards you and are shockingly easy to circumnavigate, but if you let them, they'll sneak up on you and corner you if you're not paying attention. On the opposite end of the spectrum are spawns that act more like spiders from Farpoint. They move fast and jump at your face, but neither of these are even remotely troublesome compared to mimics, who, despite being shadowy creatures like the rest of the enemies, move and act realistically like a human, spotting the player and shooting from a distance and taking cover when necessary. There are plenty of other enemies, but I won't spoil all the fun here. Even on the default normal difficulty, traveling through the wasteland will force you to move slowly and deliberately, with your head on a swivel, constantly keeping your back against walls and sprinting from cover to cover, scavenging everything you can, all while managing your health and stamina meters. And if you thought taking down enemies and simply surviving each run is what I meant by a brutal difficulty curve, well, that's only half the story. See, Into the Radius takes weapons seriously, very seriously. Say goodbye to automatic reloads, say goodbye to just 5 or 6 different types of ammo to worry about. Say goodbye to not having to worry about guns jamming or not firing because you accidentally left the safety on. If you've played DayZ, Tabor, Gray Zone Warfare, or Tarkov, maybe you're already familiar with the simulation style take on ammo, weapons, and weapon maintenance. But if this is unfamiliar territory, then it might be a little overwhelming. It was for me. But slowly you'll learn to clean weapons with a toothbrush, manually load bullets into magazines one by one, in the near endless amounts of ammo and magazines that are only used for one specific weapon. This isn't a game, it's a post-apocalyptic nightmare. But as complicated as this can feel, don't let it scare you off. To navigate this for myself, I focused on a handful of weapons, mostly a handgun, a sawed-off shotgun, and one of my favorites, the Steyr AUG, which I modified with a scope and a green laser. And eventually I learned exactly what prep work I needed to do before heading out on a mission and how to reload each weapon with relative ease. Focusing on just a few weapons allows you to manage your inventory better too. Sell all the guns and ammo you don't want and keep the rest, even if yours truly is the worst hoarder the UNPSC has ever seen. But like Wanderer before it, you've got to admire that all your stuff, no matter how much you have stacked up, is always exactly where you left it. Oh, and if cleaning your weapons with a toothbrush and toilet paper sounds a little over the top, yeah, I agree. Fortunately, you can just throw everything into a locker and pay for them to be completely repaired without wasting a whole lot of time. But you gotta give it to these guys. Everything here is about as VRAF as you could ask. Even eating, which you'll have to do on a regular basis, involves opening the lid of an aluminum can and not putting it up to your mouth, but instead grabbing a portion with your knife and putting that up to your mouth, which I don't think the game ever teaches you. Into the Radius features a pretty lengthy tutorial, but it still feels like nothing's explained. And even the stuff that is explained kind of gets explained all at once. So revisiting the training grounds after a few missions isn't the worst idea ever. As you explore the contaminated zone, there are countless dangers to keep your eyes and ears open for. But you'll want to make every run count by grabbing as much loot as you can to take back to the base and sell. And if you're used to the Saints and Sinners or more recently Snow Scout style backpack system, well, this is similar. But like so much of Into the Radius, it's all about doing things your own way. You can be reckless and just throw everything into the backpack, which is faster, or you can organize it to make sure that you know exactly where your knife or food or health or ammo or whatever is. And you can carry as much stuff as you want, but that will affect your stamina. So that's the gameplay loop. Accept missions, get out there, grab a ton of stuff, get back safely, sell whatever you can, buy whatever you need, do it all over again, and by completing certain missions, you'll slowly advance through the security ranks that'll unlock more and more powerful weapons, along with more and more dangerous missions. And while Into the Radius isn't a game that seems like it needs a story, well, there is one. It unfolds through some kind of ho-hum voiceovers and memos scattered around pretty much everywhere. There were moments I was intrigued, but mostly I just found myself pushing forward, not to see what big twist lie ahead narratively, but instead to simply progress through the missions. And that might sound like a downside, but for me it wasn't. I'm so glad I never had to stand in one space listening to people talk or read a big wall of text. It's a game about gameplay, not cinematics. And there's definitely a lot of missions here. I played through all of Into the Radius on normal difficulty, and it was definitely challenging. And because I died so many times, which meant going to find my body to recover all my loot over and over and over, it took me over 30 hours, which is about 10 hours longer than advertised. Fortunately, if you find yourself getting frustrated, you can change the difficulty mid-game and customize almost everything, from how your health is recovered to even how perceptive enemies are. Because of all the options, I'm fairly certain that anyone could jump in and find settings that work for them. Into the Radius looks sharp in the headset, and the art design here is fantastic and makes up for some of the more sparse environments. In the day-night cycle, we'll introduce more enemies at night, but we'll also let you travel under the cover of darkness. But I have to say that the audio was far more impactful than the visuals. The oppressive tones, thwumping of the anomalies, the whispers from some of the creatures, and the sounds of trains, like echoes from the past when you pass over railroad tracks. Something's clearly not right here. It's beyond unsettling. Alright, now that everyone's hyped, it's time to deflate some of that enthusiasm. Just a bit. One of Into the Radius's most surprising features on PSVR2 is the option to switch between performance and fidelity modes. Yes, fidelity features a much better draw distance, less pop-in, a longer LOD, but with some noticeable reprojection, whereas performance mode just runs at a silky smooth 90 frames per second. Well, sometimes. Whereas your home base and a lot of the first area run insanely well, beyond that the frame rate does tend to drop in some of the most surprising places, like inside this building during tense gunfights. And yeah, they happen regardless of which graphics mode you choose. So while normally it isn't bad for people like me who are sensitive to reprojection and frame rates, you probably want to pick performance over fidelity here. And there's just enough haptic feedback and adaptive trigger support to warrant a mention, even if neither is worth writing home about. Also noticeable is the VR jank, which is the best way I can describe not being able to open drawers or cabinets or climb ladders without making these slow, patient, deliberate motions. Even taking my backpack off sometimes involves some trial and error. Frequently I'll grab it off my back and it just hangs in midair until I grab it again. And while each area of the world is pretty huge, they're all separated by quick load screens that kill the immersion. It would have been so much cooler if they could have hidden the load screens with the thick fog that momentarily surrounds you and then quickly dissipates. With so many small teams making the majority of the VR games that come out these days, we have somewhat of a divide. There are some teams that keep the scope of their game extremely narrow in order to release a product that's insanely polished. Or we have developers like CM Games who were so ambitious with their game that there was no way every element was going to be perfect. But what we have with Into the Radius is something that we don't come across often in VR. And that's a fully realized game, built from the ground up for VR with deep gameplay mechanics. During my 30 hours with it, I was often overwhelmed, often frustrated. But once I came to terms with how everything worked, I fell in love with it, and despite any issue I came across, I ultimately walked away extremely satisfied.